I don't play about my primates, dog. Welcome to this episode of the Science of Monster Hunter, where today we're talking about Blangonga. I've given both Blango and Blangonga the binomial name Smilopithecus albus, which means white scythe ape. Obviously because of their white color and the giant fangs that protrude out of their canines. What is really interesting about Blango and Blangonga is it doesn't seem to be a cut and clear case of Blangonga just being older than the Blangos that they lead around. In-game, these Blangos actually seem quite mature. They have really brightly colored faces, and they have very long skulls. They also tend to do a lot of the hunting on their own, which indicates to me that something else is causing the Blangos to be small compared to the Blangonga, which is relatively large. Before we get into that, let's chat about the cranial anatomy of the Blangonga. This thing has a huge dome, particularly to accommodate a massive set of jaw muscles. Much like the apes of our world, it has a series of chewing teeth and then some incisors in the front, as well as canines, which in Blangonga are significantly larger than any other primate. A big difference between Blango, Blangonga, and the living apes is that these guys, just like all the other fang beasts of Monster Hunter, only have 3 main toes and a thumb on their foot, as opposed to having 4 down here and the opposable thumb. There's a lot of really interesting similarities and differences when it comes to comparing Blangonga to living animals. For example, just like primates, it does groom itself quite frequently. However, unlike a lot of primates, Blangonga and Blango don't seem to groom each other. They kind of just do it on their own, which is strange because in primates, grooming is one of the most important features of their social interactions, especially in the great apes, which Blangonga seems at least partially inspired by, given that it knuckle walks like a gorilla rather than moving on the palms of its hands like a baboon. Speaking of baboons, initially I was drawn to compare Blangonga with baboons because they have very similarly elongated faces, but they do share a lot more in common in terms of their anatomy with mandrills and gorillas. Baboons tend to have a skull that is pretty flat and more dog-like, whereas both mandrills and gorillas have a much larger sagittal crest up here, which is the crest of muscle that attaches to the 2 sets of jaw adductor muscles called the masseters. What's particularly interesting is that just like mandrills, Blangonga seems to be separated as a species into 2 distinct morphs. In a lot of groups of mandrills, there'll be one really large male who has a fattier rump and brighter facial coloration than the rest, which are smaller, duller in coloration, and have less fat on their rumps.
This is what a mandrill looks like, by the way, for someone who's never seen them. They're incredibly bizarre and beautiful monkeys, and a lot of people think they're baboons, but they're actually more closely related to mangabes and macaques. Their facial coloration is super interesting and resembles Blangonga's a lot, and I'll get into why it looks like that as well in a little bit.
Just like mandrills, Blangongas seem to be at least partially sexually dimorphic. It's not in the usual way we see it in animals, though, where males and females have really different coloration.
Just like Blangongas, male and female mandrills tend to have quite similar colors on their bodies. The main form of the sexual dimorphism comes in terms of their size and proportion.
Mandrills, just like Blangonga, live in groups, but unlike Blangonga and Blango, these groups can contain hundreds of individuals, as opposed to like the 3 or 4 Blangos that group together surrounding one dominant Blangonga. In mandrills, there can be multiple males within a group, but only one male tends to be the most dominant, and he has specific physical markations that I mentioned earlier. Non-dominant males aren't reduced in size to the point of being easily confused for females, however. So that gives me the idea that the Blango are probably all female, if we're going with the idea that Blangonga's social dynamics and physiology is relatively similar to mandrills. The Blango groups don't seem to be super tied to reproduction, though, which is interesting, at least if we're going with the mandrill analogy, because mandrills are pretty monogamous. They will mate with multiple females over the course of their lifetime, but generally when male mandrills are mating, they'll pick one female and stay with her for an extended period. From another angle, it might be the case that all the Blango are male and all the Blangonga are female. This fits a dynamic where, in nature, we see males kind of grouping around females and pursuing them in hopes of one of them mating with her. And it also surprisingly fits with mandrills. Outside of the physical size difference, mandrill groups tend to be matrilineal within the large group. So you'll have hundreds of mandrills grouped together in a supergroup and then little family units that are led by females. What that means is that if Blangonga is female and Blango is male, it makes more sense as a series of male suitors following one large potential mate around the ice shard cliffs. These are two conflicting hypotheses, and I will certainly look for more evidence in the future to support either one and update you on my findings. Now let's get into the more physiological side of things. Blango feet are really, really interesting. They have these super splayed out toe pads that are almost like webs. They kind of remind me of the feet of coots.
Where they have these super, super wide toes. And for coots, this helps them move through water.
But for blangos, it would help them stand on top of snow without falling through as easily by spreading their weight over more surface area. Another thing I'd like to note is that this tail almost definitely serves some kind of sexual purpose. Animals in cold environments tend to vastly reduce the size of their extremities as much as possible to avoid losing heat. And the fact that blangos have these giant, giant tails means that there's almost definitely some kind of status symbol or reproductive advantage to having a long tail. It is for sure the same with these projections on the side of the skull, and I'm calling them maxillary horns. It's also confirmed to be the same in-game by item descriptions that the whiskers serve a sexual purpose. So there is some really complex display going on here. Moving up to the physiology of Blangonga's face, as I've already talked about it a little bit, they also have these little horns that are sitting over their orbits. A lot of primates do tend to have a very large brow ridge, but as far as I'm aware, there's no examples of horned monkeys. This isn't super out of the question, and it is pretty interesting. The coloration of Blangonga's face, just like a mandrill, is assumed to have two components. This is based on all of the evidence I could find for this sort of coloration in mammals, which is kind of scant. The only blue mammals we have to go off of are the mandrills, and in their coloration, the blue on their faces, which are these big pads on the cheeks of Blangonga, are a structural coloration. Structural coloration isn't based on a colored pigment being secreted, but rather a black or brown pigment being arranged in such a way that it reflects light as a unit and appears a different color than it actually is. In this case, it's blue. And the protein being used to generate that structure is collagen, which I realize is not a pigment, but in most other cases of structural coloration, like in birds, which I'm most familiar with, there are pigments being used like melanin. The red coloration on the face of Blangonga is, I'm assuming, just like in mandrills, exposed blood vessel. Where the blood vessels are very dense and very thick and run close to the skin, you get this bright red coloration that is much more common among mammals. And because that's the case in basically all mammals, it's probably the case for Doshaguma as well. That maybe indicates potential shared ancestry between Blangonga and Doshaguma, which isn't surprising considering they have the same number of fingers and toes and they're both fang beasts. And Congalala also flushes its face, which is bald, with blood vessels when it gets enraged. So those blood vessels in the face are definitely what is coloring Blangonga and Blango for that red, because that seems to be the same mechanism in all the fanged wyverns. Or sorry, not the fanged wyverns, the fanged beasts. I'm a pedant, and you can be too, so I'm going to correct myself. Now let's talk about the ice breath. This probably isn't actually Blangonga just freezing the air, but in the ice shard cliffs, which it lives in, at least in Monster Hunter Wilds, the air is actually cold enough to just turn saliva into ice. And I know this because when you hurt Jindahad enough and it gets tired, it starts drooling. And that drool doesn't just come out of the mouth. There's a separate animation where it turns into icicles and freezes under its chin. So we know that in the right temperatures in the ice shard cliffs, saliva just turns to ice. So if Blangonga spits at you really hard and propels that spit with its breath, it will freeze on your skin and cause you ice blight. In that way, I think that ice breath is actually super realistic because it's not really ice breath. It's just a really loud scream accompanied by a copious amount of saliva. In terms of the diet of Blangonga, the dentition definitely indicates a mix of carnivory and herbivory. It has these big chewing teeth. And so while it definitely eats Raphma, which are a kind of four-legged herbivore in the ice shard cliffs, which is similar to mandrills because they prey on small antelopes, it also probably eats insects and plants to supplement its diet. This is true of the Blangos as well, as they tend to hunt in groups. These guys are really, really interesting, and I had a great time observing them. They have a lot of character, and Blango and Blangonga are definitely growing on me in terms of their design. I think they're quite interesting. Let me know which monsters you'd like me to cover next, and I hope you have a great day.